This happened to a friend of mine. She was about 20 years old, and at the time she was living with her boyfriend in their early 20s as well. And they decided that one weekend they would go camping in the woods because they were both avid campers. They packed up their car, they got their tent, sleeping bags, food and water and everything they needed for their trip, and then they drove for a couple hours to their favorite camping spot. It was a little after dark when they arrived, but it wasn't really an issue. The forest was familiar to them, so even though it was dark, they knew exactly where they were going. About 10 minutes into the walk, they found the perfect spot, set up camp, made a little fire, and went to bed. They woke up around 8 a.m. and started their day. They had breakfast around their little fire, and then they decided to go for a walk to look at the trees, take in the fresh air, and get some exercise. As they walked, they held hands, they talked, they laughed. It was the perfect day. After about an hour of walking, they came across this really tall tree. It was completely bare, and it looked like a giant finger pointing towards the sky. They walked around the tree, and then they continued on their way. 5 minutes later, they realized they couldn't remember how they got there or where they were. They didn't think much of it, so they just started walking randomly in what they thought was the right direction. About 15 minutes later, they came across a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a pentagram drawn into the grass. My friends instantly regretted stepping on it. She felt a cold sensation all over her body, and she could have sworn she heard whispers coming from the pentagram. She told her boyfriend to hold her hand tightly, and they ran out of the clearing. She could have sworn that she heard a woman's voice behind her saying, "Leave the clearing or face the consequences." They didn't know how far they had walked by now. Everything around them looked different. The trees were unfamiliar, and none of the landmarks looked the same. They tried calling out for help, but no one answered. They didn't know where they were or who to ask for help. At this point, my friend was getting really scared. She started crying. Her boyfriend tried his best to comfort her and tell her that everything was going to be okay. He told her that they were going to find their way out eventually and that they should keep walking until they found someone. As they walked through the forest, they noticed that the trees began to close in around them. They were barely able to fit a shoulder between the trunks of the trees. The branches were so thick that they blocked most of the sunlight from coming through. They could hear birds chirping, and they could see sunlight streaming through the tops of the trees. But as soon as they stepped into a clearing, the chirping would stop and the sun would disappear. My friend started to panic. She was sure that whatever was out there was watching them, waiting for them to get tired so it could attack. They kept walking, and eventually they came across a river. They had to cross the river if they wanted to get out of the forest. But before they could do anything, they heard footsteps behind them. Heavy footsteps. My friend described them as the footsteps of someone who was 8 feet tall. She told me that it sounded like tree trunks were being dragged across the forest floor. They turned around and they saw footprints in the soft dirt. Huge footprints. They were clearly much bigger than her boyfriend's size 14 boots. My friend and her boyfriend looked at each other in horror. They didn't want to stay there any longer. They wanted to cross the river and put as much distance between themselves and the forest as possible. But before they could move, they heard a voice behind them say, "You can't leave." The voice was deep and raspy, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My friend screamed and grabbed onto her boyfriend. She begged him to run. They didn't know how long they had been walking, but they had to keep going. They had to get away from whatever was in the forest. They couldn't stay there any longer. They ran as fast as they could. They didn't dare look back to see if whatever was following them had followed them. They couldn't risk it. They didn't know if it was faster than them or if it could jump over the river. They just kept running. Finally, they saw the road. They had made it. They had gotten out of the forest alive. They quickly crossed the street, and they didn't stop running until they reached their car. Once they were safely inside the car, they locked the doors and they started driving. They didn't speak. They both just stared straight ahead. They didn't want to talk about what had happened. They didn't want to admit that it had actually happened. They had been in the forest. They had seen things that they weren't supposed to see. They had heard things that they weren't supposed to hear. They finally reached their campsite. They had driven past it several times without realizing it. They had been so focused on the road, on the task of getting away from the forest, that they hadn't noticed the signs. They hadn't seen the familiar landmarks. They hadn't remembered that they had already been there. When they arrived at their campsite, they noticed that their tent was gone. Their entire campsite was completely destroyed. There were footprints in the dirt and grass. The fire pit was completely destroyed, and their tent was nowhere to be found. My friend called the police and told them what had happened. She explained how she and her boyfriend had gotten lost in the forest and how they had been followed by large footprints and a strange man's voice. She described the clearing and the pentagram and the destruction of their campsite. The police didn't believe her. They thought that she was crazy. They told her that there was no record of anyone else being in the park and that if she had seen footprints, they were probably from a bear. She insisted that she was telling the truth, but the police wouldn't listen. They hung up on her. She and her boyfriend gathered what little things they had left and they drove home. They didn't stop on the way home. They didn't eat, drink, or sleep. They just kept driving until they reached their house. When they arrived home, they didn't go inside. They just sat in the driveway and cried. They hugged each other and they tried to make sense of what had happened. They had been in the forest. They had seen things that they weren't supposed to see. They had heard things that they weren't supposed to hear. And no one believed them. No one believed their story. They felt alone. They felt scared. They didn't know what to do. The next day, my friend called the police again. She told them that she needed to report another crime. She told them that she had been the victim of assault. She described what had happened in detail, but the police still didn't believe her. They thought that she was crazy. They thought that she was making the whole thing up. She gave up. She stopped calling the police. She stopped talking about what had happened. She tried to move on with her life, but she couldn't. She couldn't let go of what had happened in the forest. She couldn't forget the sound of the footsteps or the voice. She couldn't forget the feeling of terror that had gripped her heart when she realized that she and her boyfriend had been followed. She tried seeing a therapist, but the therapist didn't believe her either. He thought that she was making the whole thing up. He thought that she was crazy. One night, my friend was awoken in the middle of the night by a terrible feeling. She sat up in bed and she could have sworn that she heard the sound of footsteps outside of her window. She could have sworn that she heard the same voice that had followed her in the forest. She could have sworn that she saw the shadow of a tall, thin man standing at the end of her bed. She screamed and buried her head under the blankets. She didn't want to see what was in her room. She didn't want to hear what was outside of her window. But she knew that whatever was out there, it was real. Has never forgotten that night. Has never forgotten the feeling of terror that has gripped her heart. Has never forgotten the sound of the footsteps or the voice. Has never forgotten what happened in the forest. And neither has her boyfriend. To this day, they will never go camping again. They will never go into the woods again. They are too afraid.